let's take a look at 20th century architecture in the prairie style. So once again, we took a look at this before, so by way of review, here we see the cantilevers. We see that in the prairie style, the architect wants to incorporate the building into the landscaping. I mentioned to you how the Kaufmans wanted to be looking at the waterfall while they relaxed during the weekends and they were on holiday, and take a respite from their busy lives. They were very wealthy and ran businesses, so they asked Frank Lloyd Wright to design a home with their specifications, and he pulled this out of his hat 45 minutes before he met with the Mr. Kaufman, who was very distraught that he had not heard from him in so long. And look at the masterpiece that he came up with. So here we see a stock image of the home. Notice how he's using the environment to show us the home being part of the actual rocks in the area. Here we see the cantilevered terraces, and only very small portions of the house is there any verticality. The emphasis is on the horizontal. Okay, so Frank Lloyd Wright is the architect. Prairie style, reinforced concrete, sandstone, iron, and steel. We also have a lot of rocks that were part of the area. And the exact definition for cantilever is a projecting beam that is attached to a building at one end but suspended in the air on the other. And this is such an important work that we really want to take a look at more of this work. Okay, so Frank Lloyd Wright and Falling Water. We know that the architect his name is Frank Lloyd Wright, and in his composition he used organic items, and it aligns itself with a waterfall, and it's as if though the river runs right through the house rather than right next to it, which was his intention. And it's to incorporate the house into nature. So what was the function? Why was this house requested? Why was it designed and built? Okay, so it was the weekend home of the Kaufman family, and they hired Frank Lloyd Wright to design the home, and it combined man-made architecture with nature, and he wanted to cohesively make them one. So what's the content? Obviously it's the house, but let's take a deeper look at what encompassed that. It was south-southeast orientation of the house, so it gives the illusion that the stream flows through the house rather than next to it. Okay, it stems from his transcendentalist background and the belief that human life is a part of nature. It was built to incorporate the stream in it. It also incorporated the rocks that were an outcrop of the area that they built the house on, and it projected above the living room floor, uniting the house with the earth. The glass windows stretched all the way across so you could view the waterfall, further incorporating the inside with the outside, and the man-made structure with nature. And the corner turning windows without mullions are used so that the corners, when you're there, they seem to vanish. Okay, so what is the context? What is happening in the world? What is happening in America at the time? What is happening architecturally? So in the 20s and 30s, this was a very difficult time. Why? Because of the Great Depression, right? So at this time, architects are like, what? People don't have the money to hire an architect, to build something, to finish something. So at this time, you didn't have a whole lot of private homes being built because people couldn't afford it. And so Wright, just as an aside, was considered the greatest architect of the 19th century. So these are just what might seem as random facts, but all Excuse me, I'm getting the hiccups. Very relevant to our study of this particular piece. So let's contrast international and prairie style. Wright began to lose leeway with the rest of the architectural world, unfortunately. With the international style, architects were more focused towards modernism. Many believed that his time had long passed and he was heavily criticized. However, Wright created the most famous home in America with Falling Waters. So you are not always recognized as an artist or as an architect during your lifetime or even shortly thereafter. It may come a short time later, sometimes hundreds of years later, sometimes centuries later. So the inspiration, we talked about transcendentalism, how human life and nature are intertwined. The response to European modernist design that he helped inspire, but that same design ideal was also heavily criticizing him. So he, as we mentioned, he procrastinated. He did nothing for 9 months, and then when Mr. Kaufman was obviously agitated at the lack of work that had been done on his home, he was able to do it in no time at all. It says that he drew up the plans. His rough sketch took about 45 minutes, and in about 2 hours, he was done with everything he needed to present his ideas. Believes that he has made the landscape more beautiful after he finished his work. Okay, so he's improving on the on nature and on the surroundings of the house as opposed to focusing on the house. Okay, so Falling Water is falling down. There's a lot of renovation that is always taking place with Falling Water. The ground where the house was planned to be built was not wholly stable at first, so almost put the project to a halt. So he agreed to use more steel reinforcements, which in turn would help to stabilize the home. However, every few years they would find cracks in the concrete balconies that had to be repaired to make sure that the entire building didn't collapse. After years of the repairs, the problem was finally solved by using tension cables to stabilize the house. Now, this being said, and being part of the narrative that we study in art history, I can tell you that when my husband and I visited Falling Water a couple of years ago, that the house is still not stable, and there's still a lot of remediation work being done to the site. This is the interior of the house. Again, the prairie style. Reinforced concrete with sandstone. You will remember that we talked about the corners of the house not having mullions, and here we see how he just had glass so that it just seemed to be on a continuum. This tree was incorporated into the house and through the house so that it could feel like it was one with nature. And this is the plans, the ground plan and the details of the house. And this is Gemini in front of Falling Water. And it's a UNESCO site. When I was with you, I went over with you what a UNESCO site is. And China has many, many, many UNESCO sites. In fact, when I left Wuxi University, it was very bittersweet because you know that I became very attached to you all. We went to Changsha and Luoyang and Shanghai and Beijing, and we saw different UNESCO sites while we were there. And we saw some also when we were there the first time. So this is a site that is so important to the entire world that there is a world committee that comes alongside the structure, or it could be a natural preserve like the Grand Canyon or the Everglades. It could be a park. That it's so important that this organization comes alongside and helps. Here's another image of falling water. This one was taken by Jim. These are other images of the house. And so from here, we're gonna go to 20th century architecture, the international style. Okay, so the belief here was a little different from the one that we just looked at with Frank Lloyd Wright's Prairie Style. This philosophy was that houses should be a machine for living. It was influenced by the streamlined qualities of the Bauhaus, clean, spacious white lines, skeleton structure with glass wrapping around the walls that we've talked about before, lack of architectural ornamentation, and no painting or sculptures on exterior surfaces. Okay. So this is the exterior of Villa Savoy. This is a home in the style of International. It was constructed with steel and reinforced concrete, 1929, and it's in Poissy-sur-Seine in France, just outside Paris. So let's take a look at this. We looked at with great detail at the Prairie Style, so we want to give this the same amount of time to be fair and balanced. So first I want to show you an overview of the house. Notice that before you had an emphasis on the horizontal, but what do we have here? It looks like a box for living, right? And here we have structures that are not horizontal like in the Prairie Style. This is the exterior of the home. This is the shower. Now remember, what is the date on this? 1929. Look how modern this looks by our standards. So it's 1929, steel and reinforced concrete and form follows functions. So these are more pictures of the exterior. This was taken from the outside. And then before we go to the next building, I want to go back and have us take a look at more details from this work. Okay, so the function, because we've already looked at the architect. Le Corbusier had a notion that a house should be a machine for living, summing up the International style from the 20s through the 50s. Okay, it was an attempt to combine the ideals of classicism and modern architecture during the machine age, and it was meant to be practical. Commissioned by the Savoy family as a country home in France, and the patrons, the people that commissioned Le Corbusier to do this were Pierre and Émilie Savoy. Let's look at the content. So what are the characteristics of this style? It's clean, spacious, white lines, and this is what defined the facade of the house, and the facade is the outside. It was simple, lacked architectural ornamentation, avoided sculptures and painting. The main part was lifted off the ground, almost as high as though it was a floating box, lifted only by narrow pilotis, which were thin freestanding posts. And a pilote, one is a column of iron, steel, or reinforced concrete supporting a building that's living above an open ground level. It had a horizontal quality, and so it was a sort of abstraction of a house. It had ribbon windows, thin strips of windows that wind themselves around the building, as you can see. and the roof also acted as a patio. So that picture that I showed you just a moment ago, you saw the stairs, you saw entrances to the house, but it was a wide open space, and that served as a patio as well. So remember, the form following the function. So all space is used in some way. There was nothing there for show, nothing superfluous, everything had a reason for being there. You had in the interior free and open ground plan to allow dynamics of the room to be arranged however the patrons saw fit. So basically what that's saying is, given the structure of the house, you were able to move around your furniture or make changes as you saw fit whenever you wanted to, because it was a playground for you to work with. It had plenty of natural light, and due to the windows wrapping around almost the entirety of the floor, you had just this continuum of light everywhere. So what was the context? Machine age, modern age in which machines were valued for their efficiency. So, and Le Corbusier also appreciated them for their beauty. So he believed that form should follow function similar to Sullivan. However, Corbusier was more intent on the elegance and simplicity of straight, clean lines to represent perfection and idealism of form in the machine age, while Sullivan was more focused on the importance of function in terms of something that's practical. Okay, and we've already spoken of the patrons. We can take a closer look here and look at the pilotis, the windows that wrapped around, the roof, which right up here also acted as a patio for you to sit in, right in here. And you could climb up these stairs as well. Check out that bathroom. Looks like what they're doing right now architecturally with the pools. Here we see the roof line again. And now on to the Seagram building in New York City by Ludwig Mies van der Rohe and Philip Johnson. So also in the international style, the medium is steel frame and glass curtain wall with bronze. And this was created between 56 and 58. This is also a UNESCO World Heritage Site. So you see they have a fountain and a huge courtyard in front. These are some of the AP students that we went together to see some of the pieces that we studied. We will not get into the particulars of this. I'm gonna just kind of tell you. So this is a one of many skyscrapers that we see in New York City, and because the land was so important and valuable, things tended to go up rather than out, and so the outside reflection of the bronze was to reflect the other buildings around it. In addition to having this pool, it also had office spaces in the inside, and Seagram was actually a liquor company, and they had this building built so that they could conduct their internal affairs and everything else. Okay, moving on to abstract expressionism in the 50s. Okay. We've looked at Willem de Kooning, and we've also talked about Mondrian. And just as a brief reminder, the New York School, the first American avant-garde art movement, this is something important to remember. This was a reaction against artists like Mondrian, which Piet Mondrian is the one that we just saw with red, blue, and yellow. So what were the abstract expressionists looking for? Okay, more active representation of the hand of the artist. What more active do you want than this? You see the brush strokes on the side. Look at the feet. Very little definition. And I mentioned before that when this work was done by de Kooning, he had about 200 drafts of this, but one on top of the other. So that's pretty amazing. Okay, woman one, and we'll take a look at his work in terms of looking at it from a close up and knowing that what he was trying to achieve was a parody of all the pinups that were prevalent during this time period. Before we get to Jackson Pollock, let's look at a little bit of the narration on this work. So we're looking at layers of brushstrokes in rapid succession over a prolonged period of time. So he would start painting and leave it and come back to it and change it. He seemed more focused on the process than on the finished product. And when you look at it and you detail it and you study it and you're with it, you see that he just wanted to continue with the process as opposed to having an image, an exact image that he had in mind that he wanted to reproduce. So the brush strokes are muscular, tough. The paint is brushed on very thickly. It's garish. So the word garish means like tacky and gaudy and yucky. Like you look at it and you're like, ah, especially with those teeth. It has brilliant pinks, oranges, yellows, and then you have muddy flesh tones. Border of silver along the right side, and then you have olive green near the bottom of the canvas. Don't you think that's interesting? Look, here you have the silver, and here you have a little bit of the green. Okay, so what was the function? Portraying the female figure in an aggressive way in terms of content and form. Aggressive, unnatural, overly sexualized, but not in a traditional way. Why? Because this was supposed to be a parody. This was supposed to be a mockery of the modern pinup. So here we see in terms of content, what are we looking at? It's reminiscent of the seated Madonnas, but made profane and commercialized. Okay, so the Madonnas were Christian figures, right? And this figure is obviously not something that is beautiful as the Madonnas were, but profanity is when you use bad language. So they commercialized it and made her raunchy and nasty. So she has big bulging eyes, her teeth are bared, her breasts are large and emphasized. She reminds us of how women were being portrayed during this time on movie screens and posters. The pinup girls were sultry, sexy, sensual, red lipstick, heavily applied mascara, think Marilyn Monroe. And then the field in the background is abstract. So there seems to be a human form here somewhere, but it's difficult to pinpoint. So we see a little bit of an, I want to say like an allusion more than anything to Cubism. Okay, so de Kooning used this as fuel for his creative energy. Everything that we just talked about, the commercialization of the female figure and the contemporary visual culture. Okay, so de Kooning is one of the central abstract expressionists. He was friends with Jackson Pollock, who was also an abstract artist, and then Mark Rothko, who was a color field artist. He was professionally trained, so in his group, he was one of the few that had actually training in art as his background. And he wanted to find meaning in visual arts in the chaos of mass production of images. So, very interesting, right? So, woman one, Willem de Kooning, abstract expressionism. And now let's take a look at Jackson Pollock with abstract expressionism. So Jackson Pollock was a very interesting man. He had a turbulent existence right up until his death. His work was such that he created it by throwing paint. It looks like it's haphazard, but To him, it was very premeditated, and he wanted it to have a lot of meaning. And so he would throw the work on the ground, different colors, and then he would roll around in the paint. And here we see different works by Jackson Pollock. And now on to color field painting in the 60s. So again, we looked at this earlier. Helen Frankenthaler, what she would do is she would put the paint on the canvas and let it drip, and then it would become more saturated in some areas more than other. This particular one is known as the Bay, and it's acrylic on canvas. And here we have 4 different works by Helen Frankenthaler. This particular one has not been on view for at least 8 years or so. When it's at the Detroit Museum of Art. However, when we were there and we looked at the Diego Rivera's, his frescoes, this was not on view, and they informed me that it had not been on view for a while because they're using the area for other exhibitions. So, but here are examples of some of her other work. Okay, then color field with Mark Rothko. He had one of the largest exhibitions recently in Washington, D.C. that we were able to see. It was wonderful. He also started out not as an abstract artist, but rather an artist that had watercolors and oils, and then he continued to explore, and this is what his current work looks like. Just working with color. Okay, for our next section, we're going to look at pop art and Marilyn Monroe, Roy Lichtenstein. We're going to look at the Andy Warhol Museum. So, and then we're going to look at Lipstick Ascending on Caterpillar Tracks and Clyde Oldenburg, who passed away recently. So in our next segment, this is where we're going to be going to pop art of the 1960s. So, pop art means popular art. It gained momentum in the 50s, climaxed in the 60s. Materials of the everyday world, the mass popular culture, consumer goods or famous singers. So those were the themes. No distinction between high art or design of mass-produced items. So high art meaning that you had an original on a canvas, oil, and it was all dignified and stuff. So they said, look, you know, it is what it is. It can be reproduced, and that's fine. All about the commonplace, bringing viewers face to face with the reality of the work, with the reality of what is. Thought to be a reaction against abstract expressionism. Post-World War II, there was enormous growth in American economy and consumerism. So spend more money. Okay. So we're going to be looking at a figure by Roy Lichtenstein, who's a very famous pop artist, and this one is called Hopeless. So he uses little dots, pointillism. Okay, in this case, they've given, in the case of Seurat, they refer to it as pointillism, and that's in fact what is happening here. However, some call it Ben-Day dots to refer to the technique being employed in the modern day. So named after illustrator and printer Benjamin Day, similar to pointillism, depending on the effect, color, and optical illusion needed, small colored dots are closely spaced, widely spaced, or overlapping. Good. So that's the way it should have begun, but it's hopeless. Okay, and then our image is that of the Maryland diptych based on Marilyn Monroe. So Andy Warhol, pop art, oil, acrylic, and silk screen enamel on a canvas. So there's a lot going on this. The date is 1962, and this particular one is his original. So what's a silk screen? It's a printing technique that passes ink or paint through a stenciled image to make multiple copies. This is such an iconic piece that we absolutely must look into it. I don't want to paraphrase because there's just so much into it. There's so much information on this, and it's a lot easier if I can just share with you from the written word. So, what was the process under form? Remember, the form is how did we get to this piece originally? So in the silk screen process, we have pre-made images where colors are chosen for the overall composition. The image is placed underneath a screen. The artist spreads usually black ink evenly over the screens using a wide squeegee. So a squeegee is that little tool that has a handle, and then it has like a little knife-like area or a wedge, and you use it to like clean your shower stall or remove water from something, or create the black defined shading on the work. So that's how that was produced. And silk screen is a printing technique that passes ink or paint through a stenciled image to make multiple copies. So what does the composition look like? Made on 2 silver canvases were Warhol silk screened a photograph of Marilyn Monroe 50 times. It's a huge work. The color is seemingly carelessly handled with paint across the canvas. So there's an even distribution of form and color across the canvas. It allows the viewer's eyes to wander all over, and you're not focusing on one spot or image. So this is a hallmark, meaning this is one of the trademarks of this particular kind of work. So in abstract expressionism, you have Jackson Pollock doing his drip paintings in particular, right? So what was the function? Why was this made? What was the purpose behind it? So it was to create an almost devotional image of a pop icon. And an icon is anything that is so big that everything is centered about that. Like if you're talking about sex symbols of this time period, Marilyn Monroe would be the icon. So Warhol took a picture of her and appropriated it, meaning he took that photo and mass produced it. It was seductive. She's heavy-lidded eyes, her lips are parted, expression is inscrutable, meaning you can't really figure out what she's thinking. So she's closing her eyes and opening her mouth a little, right? Repetition makes viewers uncomfortable. Why? Because her face becomes eerie, inanimate, and a type of mask. The use of the silk screen. So it flattens her face by using unmodulated color, no gradual shading to create a 3D quality. Makes her look like an automaton. So that's like a kind of robot. When you do this to the work, she doesn't look real and lifelike. So no emotions, fake or plastic. Makes her into a manufactured star with a made-up name, merely a one-dimensional sex symbol. Perhaps not the most appropriate object of our almost religious devotion, because remember that she was made to almost look like an icon. Okay, so the makeup was garish with purple and pastels, and it almost mimics the face of somebody that's been embalmed. So oftentimes if in a burial, for instance, the custom in the United States is if you can afford it, you will have a funeral where the person has been partially embalmed, and they apply makeup to them, they fix their hair, and they leave the casket open so you can say goodbye to the person. Okay. Warhol took up this endeavor of creating these ghostly images of Marilyn after she committed suicide. Now, there is, I have to have a little disclaimer here, there is a theory that because she was involved with John F. Kennedy while he was president, and also some other people, that there may have been something shady happening with her. Some people speculate that she was murdered and that she did not commit suicide. So I'm just putting that out there, and no one really knows. I mean, some people may know, but the people at large, the population at large in the US does not know. Okay, so grids. Usually when you see a grid is something that makes little boxes, usually seen as a form of abstract expressionism, but here it's without tenderness, no intimacy, and that's what's characteristic with abstract expressionism. Instead, he uses the grid to remind us of automation, mechanization, reproduction elevates this form of art, and tries to prove that painting is no longer the popular medium for popular culture. So we've gone from having the paintings itself in oil, and then we're not at the acrylic stage yet, but almost, and perhaps in some instances, and so they're playing around with different mediums and reproducing works, because the majority of society cannot afford to have an artist that is very renowned and acknowledged. They cannot buy their work. You have to buy a reproduction, a copy, etc., right? So they're trying to mass produce it. Okay, what does Warhol do? He tries to desensitize the work by repeated exposure. So he says that if you continuously are exposed to that same image, you become desensitized to it. So let's say that there's something really great. For instance, the first example that popped into my mind is I live on a lake. And so it's very beautiful to look outside, but when you see the lake every day, you're not noticing the inherent beauty that's there. You see it, but you don't experience it the same way because you've grown accustomed to it. So this is his point. He's saying the more you see something, whether it's violence in the media, whether it's a war that doesn't seem to have an end in sight, you're like, oh, okay, different day, same thing. You become desensitized. Okay? Resensitizing Warhol makes Monroe's face so unfamiliar and strange. What's he trying to do? He may have been trying to resensitize us to her image, to remember that she isn't actually a symbol, but a human being whose life is over, and she should be pitied. In life, Norma Jean, as was her name, she had a lot of drama and a lot of suffering in her life, and yet a lot of her film work is very happy, and she sings, and one of her best known works is Some Like It Hot, and it's really hilarious, really well done movie. Wonderful, wonderful movie. One of Hollywood's best movies, in my opinion, and the opinion of many people that are into film. And yet her life was anything but that. She had several failed marriages. She purportedly had affairs with married men, etc. And so, did she commit suicide or not? We don't know. So, what context? Warhol escaped to New York in an intense and love and obsession for automation. He wanted to make it fine art. The same way we view fine art, started making advertisements as art. This is important. because this is a time of people buying and buying and buying, a time of consumerism, and that's still in effect in our country today. Pop art, we see that with the Campbell soup, Coca-Cola, the Brillo pad. So these are images that he took and did the same thing he did with the Maryland face. Okay, so Warhol worked on commission for years, so that was his primary source of income. And so he would create pop art portraits of people for $25,000, which is a mere $25,000 because he was very famous at the time. So what is the history of this? Inspired by art that was popular in New York at the time, specifically Jackson Pollock and Willem de Kooning. So these were the icons of the time. Okay. So here we get to, I'm going to give you a moment so that you can study this and see if you agree that yes, in fact, you are becoming desensitized to her. Notice the shading, how when you use this process of silk screen and you're applying the ink, it's going to be heavier. Look at this line here, how we see more black ink that was deposited here on the side of her face. And look at this here. This one's almost blurred out of the entire canvas. This one's so light you can barely see it either. So we have her here, the tomato soup. Here's Che Guevara. This is Andy Warhol himself. And look at this. So this is an image of the Last Supper. And then he's putting here advertisements of the day. Dove soap, General Electric. So that's very much out there, right? He has a museum that has only his work. It's called the Andy Warhol Museum in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. And they had this really cool couch that we couldn't resist but to take a little picture on it. More examples of pop art. Here we see the type that Lichtenstein created with the dots. Here we see one of the Maryland triptychs. Pop art again. And then we come to Lipstick Ascending on Caterpillar Tracks by Claes Oldenburg. So what would Claes do? He would take ordinary objects and create large sculptures of them. So this sculpture was originally created with plywood and vinyl, and then it was refurbished in Cordston steel, aluminum, and fiberglass. So this creation went on from 1969 to 74, and that's because there were various iterations of this. So I'm going to try going to the Khan Academy an article, because you'll be able to see what it started off as. So this is Claes Oldenburg, and he's standing next to Lipstick on Caterpillar Tails, but notice that this is not the one that we saw, because this was an early one. And this was initially in the Benecke Plaza at Yale University. Okay, so what are we seeing? A big tube of lipstick. It's sprouting from a military vehicle. We see that here, which appeared uninvited on the campus of Yale amidst the 1969 student protests against the Vietnam War. While the sculpture may have seemed like a playful, if elaborate, artistic joke, Claes Oldenburg's Lipstick Ascending on Caterpillar Tracks was also deeply critical. So it was 24 foot high. He collaborated with architecture students at his alma mater, meaning he went to that school as well, and then he delivered it to the Benecke Plaza. Okay, so it overlooked the office of Yale's president and a prominent World War I memorial. This claimed a visible space for the anti-war movement while also poking fun of the solemnity of the plaza, because it was supposed to be very decorous and very solemn, right? So this was also the backdrop for several student protests. If you hear or see any of the news of what's happening in the United States, we've had a lot of protests in some of the most renowned of our universities, and this has become a big issue, a big topic in our country. So this is one way that they protested in the 60s. So these were maquettes for Claes Oldenburg's lipstick, meaning these were like his trials, and these were showing the stages of inflatables. So this was never intended for the original sculpture to be permanent. They thought that, oh, okay, we're just gonna make this and then it's gonna go away. However, the mechanism didn't always work with the balloon, so the original remained in Benecke Plaza for a few months after it was removed, and then they made the form in metal. So this was placed in a less prominent place in Yale, and it remains to this day. So we were very blessed to be able to go in and see this, my husband and I, because it's inside. We went at a time when school was not in session, and it's inside the area, the courtyard area of one of the dorms. So we were very blessed that someone was walking by and we got their attention, and they were able to let us in, and we were able to see it and take pictures and take videos, as you're gonna see. So this dealt with gender, consumerism, and the war. In addition to feminine association, the large lipstick tube is phallic and bullet-like, making the benign beauty product seem masculine or violent. The juxtaposition implied that the U.S. obsession with beauty and consumption fueled and distracted from the ongoing violence in Vietnam. So many people in the United States at the time of the Vietnam were not supportive of the involvement, and this was their way of protesting and letting their voices be heard. Okay, so after they designed the final version, he exposed it to the public, and then he began creating other sculptures that we're going to be looking at in the next couple of slides. So he says, I am, and this is a declaration he made in 61, I am for an art that is political, erotical, mystical, that does something other than sit on its, and I'm going to omit the next word, sit on its rear end in a museum. I am for an art that imitates the human, that's comic, if necessary, or violent, or whatever is necessary. So, I hope you enjoyed that. I think that that definitely happens to be one of my favorite articles from Khan Academy, because it really fills you on things that if you are not familiar with this, you would not know what the piece is about, if you're not familiar with the piece. And let me amplify this a minute, enter full screen, and then let's go to the next one. Here we go. I'm trying to get to full screen, but it's not working right now, so we'll see in a little bit. And here I am in front of Lipstick with Caterpillar Tracks. Here are two other Claes Oldenburg pieces that we've seen And right now I cannot tell you where I saw them, and I saw that I did not include this, but one of them I believe is in France, but don't quote me on that. The next time we meet, I'm gonna have that information for you. I'll plug it in, pun intended, see, plug. And now we're gonna go into performance art, which means exactly that. We had talked about performance art originally with it being a form of a production that has something symbolic or something that you are made to look at and feel. And in this case, it's a cut piece by Yoko Ono. And what she did was she was sitting down and she invited people from the audience to come and cut her clothes off. Now Happenings. Happenings was coined in the 50s, and it's a performance. It's initially planned, but then you also have spontaneity, improv, audience participation. So today we could have flash mobs, improv theater, and performance art. And here we see Yayoi Kusama with her balls, which were Your Narcissism for Sale. And this is her here. This was this installation originally was in Venice during the Biennale ceremonies that take place once a year. And she would sell the balls for $1, and you would stare at them, see your reflection, and she would say, "This is your narcissism on sale." This is an example of how they have recreated these happenings in different parts of the country and of the world, in Tampa and LA. So these are infinity rooms. I got to see it in New York City at the Botanical Gardens, right here, a couple of years back. And here we had Yayoi Kusama's Narcissus Garden. Other works from Yayoi. It was a huge installation that took place inside and outside. Okay, so hyperrealism and photorealism. This was when you focused your artwork on something that was not the ordinary thing you would think of seeing in a picture, right? So if it's hyperrealism, it's realistic as opposed to the paintings or the sculptures that were made to look very impressive, and people were made to look very young and very cultured and very powerful. So that instead of being surreal, this was very hyper real. Here's another example. So the artist removed extraneous details so that people wouldn't be distracted when they're looking at the image. And then earth art or side art, and one of the most famous ones and the one that's in the curriculum is the Spiral Jetty, which is located in Utah. And so what happens in earth or side art is that you take earthen materials and you create something with it, and you expect that that item is going to change and or atrophy with time. This was created by Robert Smithson, and it's in Great Salt Lake, Utah. He created it in 1970. So this is something that is maintained by a group, but it's also left to morph on its own. This is what it looks like from last year. So this is right now a year old. In fact, I am going to Salt Lake City right now, starting on Sunday, to do the reading for the AP Art History. So this is the Spiral Jetty, and you see how right now the water level has been very low, and you get to see it very carefully. So feminist sculpture. As a response to the rise in feminist work around the world, we have Judy Chicago. She's the premier feminist artist in our time, and this is called the Dinner Party, and it's multimedia including ceramics and stitchery. Okay, and what she's done is she's taken different symbols but made them so that they look quasi-erotic, and introduced some historic items. For instance, this is making a reference to Judith, the one that beheaded Holofernes. This is called Immortal Goddess. Instead of Immortal Goddess, this is Immortal. This is Virginia Woolf, but she scratched off the V. Emily Dickinson, who was a poet, etc. Postmodernism architecture. So we looked at the prairie style, and we looked at the international style, and now we're going to look at the postmodern architecture. So this emerged in late 70s and 80s, a reaction to the international, and so we incorporated in this style a lot of extra allusions to the past, references to the past. Here we see the front of the house. It was made by Robert Venturi, John Roche, Denise Scott Brown, and this is postmodernism. It's wood frame and stucco. So this was created for a family where one of the couple was a musician, and so you see a couple of pianos, an organ, chairs to sit on, etc. This house is in private hands now, and it cannot be seen. However, we managed to find the house, even though it's not readily on Google Maps, and we got to see the house from the outside within the property, but it is a private property. So we will leave off there and continue at another time. Thank you for your attention.